Hello, welcome to my biomechanical analysis. So the sprint start encompasses the initial stages of a sprint and is the transition from a stationary starting position to a phase of high velocity running. The components of the movement are the block phase, which relates to the body position at the start of the race and the initial acceleration from the starting block, as well as the first stance phase, which involves the initial contact on the track after exiting the block phase. The factors surrounding each component can be further broken down with the deterministic model shown on screen. And the primary goal of a sprint start is to produce an initial impulse that maximizes horizontal acceleration with respect to the time taken and to allow an athlete to reach their maximum horizontal velocity for the remaining sprint. Now, there are 5 critical features that can be observed during a sprint start, which allow athletes to reach their maximum velocity in the quickest time through rapid acceleration. So these qualitative features include the position of the hips relative to the trunk and head in the set position, the sequence of joint movements in the front leg during the block phase, and the strike pattern of the foot during the first stance phase. The quantitative features are the degree of flexion in the knee joint of the rear leg and the horizontal impulse, velocity, and acceleration during the block clearance phase. There are many biomechanical principles that are important to each of these critical features and can be used to analyze the performance of the skill. An ideal set position requires the hips to be raised higher than the shoulders, with the head and neck aligned with the spine. This shifts the center of gravity down and forward such that both legs lie behind the line of gravity. A lower center of gravity reduces the vertical component of the ground reaction force and facilitates horizontal force production, which maximizes the horizontal velocity and acceleration during the sprint start. In the block clearance phase, a proximal to distal extension of the front leg joints allows for the generation of a greater impulse. The larger impulse works to directly increase velocity according to the impulse-momentum relationship as described by Newton's second law. Additionally, this method of joint extension prioritizes force application in the horizontal direction, which helps the runner to increase their horizontal velocity. The application of a forefoot strike during the first stance following the block phase allows an athlete to maintain their momentum from block clearance. Striking the ground with the anterior region of the forefoot maximizes the magnitude of the forward horizontal component of the ground reaction force, and the foot strike should occur behind the center of gravity to reduce the horizontal braking forces generated. The degree of flexion in the rear leg knee joint is a major contributing factor to the block phase impulse, as increasing the extension of this joint will allow the runner to exert a stronger force on the starting block. This works to maximize the acceleration during block clearance by enabling the athlete to produce a greater impulse. Finally, the horizontal impulse applied during the block phase directly influences the velocity and acceleration of the runner, and it's a key quantitative measure that must be considered when performing and analyzing the skill. The movement was captured with an iPad mounted on a tripod 5 meters away from the runner in slow motion to increase the frame rate to 120 FPS. It was filmed perpendicular to the runner, viewing from the sagittal plane at 90 degrees, and it was also filmed at a similar height to the runner with a 1 meter ruler directly beside the starting block for scale. The runner wore plain dark clothing and was filmed against a white background for sufficient contrast with reflective markers placed on key joints to facilitate movement tracking during post-recording analysis in Canovia. Natural lighting from behind the camera prevented glare during filming, and verbal instructions of ready, set, go were given to the runner to mimic an authentic sprint start. 3 trials were conducted to ensure the movement was completed correctly and to the best of the runner's ability. Kasuga et al.'s 2014 study found that the ideal set position for a sprinter will have the hips positioned higher than the shoulders, which allows the spine and neck to descend anteriorly and inferiorly from the hips. The head should be positioned in line with the spine and neck to shift the center of gravity downwards and forwards. In the trial, the runner's head is visibly out of line from the rest of their body, and there is a clear curvature in the spine. This impacts sprint start performance and can cause poorer block clearance times, reduced takeoff velocity, and a reduced force application on the block. Studies from both Lee et al. In 2024 and Velamatos et al. In 2022 found that the front leg generates 66 to 76% of total horizontal impulse in a sprint start, and that the sequential extension of front leg joints in a proximal to distal manner maximizes force application to the starting blocks. In the trial, knee joint extension occurs first, followed by the extension of the hip and ankle joints at approximately the same time. This reduces the impulse created due to poor force application on the starting block, and this decreases block clearance time as well. There is also a stronger vertical force component in the ground reaction force, which must act against the runner's center of gravity, thus reducing horizontal velocity. Almeida et al.'s meta-analysis in 2015 concluded that a forefoot strike behind the center of mass is the optimal technique to carry momentum and reduce horizontal braking forces. In the trial, the runner correctly applies a foot strike behind the center of mass, but they use both their midfoot and forefoot to achieve this. This increases the vertical force component, which reduces the horizontal velocity and momentum of the runner. Hip and trunk alignment can be corrected by lowering the head such that it follows the trajectory of the spine and neck. DeBera et al.'s 2015 study also recommends placing the arms further forward, which allows the back to be straight as it descends. This lowers the center of gravity and supports horizontal impulse production. The incorrect joint movements can be corrected by ensuring that the hip joint extends first, followed by the knee joint, then finally the ankle joint. Nagahara and colleagues recommend spacing the starting blocks further apart, which enables the runner to focus on specific and sequential joint extensions, and this also aids the horizontal force production and can help increase velocity. Miyamoto et al.'s 2018 study suggests that foot strike patterns can be corrected by focusing on applying a toe strike, which is achieved using the anterior region of the forefoot. It prevents the use of the midfoot during the stride and helps the runner to reduce momentum loss while ensuring that no excessive force is applied in that vertical direction. Bezotis and colleagues concluded that the optimal degree of flexion in the rear leg knee joint is between 90 and 135 degrees, with a lower degree allowing for a greater range of motion during joint extension. A greater range of motion in joint extension increases the magnitude of force that can be applied to the starting block, which directly influences velocity and acceleration. In the trial, the runner's knee joint flexion was 110.7 degrees, which falls within the optimal range. However, a study from Milanese et al. In 2014 compared the effect of a 90-degree, 115-degree, and 130-degree angle and determined that a 90-degree angle facilitates the production of the greatest horizontal impulse during block clearance compared to those other two angles. Ilay et al.'s 2013 experiment concluded that a primary mechanism for increasing the average velocity is to minimize block clearance time. It also found that the average clearance time for a professional sprinter was 0.3 seconds, while the average velocity and average acceleration was 3.57 meters per second and up to 6 meters per second squared, respectively. Analysis of the trial in Konovia revealed a clearance time of 0.54 seconds, which directly impacted the average velocity and horizontal impulse for the sprint start. As seen in the calculations, with a displacement of 61.3 centimeters and time of 0.54 seconds, the average velocity was found to be 1.135 meters per second, while the final velocity was 3.07 meters per second according to tracking in Konovia. Substituting these values into the relevant formulas yielded a horizontal acceleration of 5.69 meters per second squared and a horizontal impulse of 285.75 newton seconds, which falls well below the standard of professional sprinters. The rear leg knee flexion can be reduced to 90 degrees for optimal performance, as described in the literature from Milanese and colleagues. To achieve this, the set position must be altered by either changing the spacing between the starting blocks or by having the runner place their hands further forwards or backwards. This will allow the knee joint angle to increase or decrease as necessary. Similarly, to improve upon horizontal impulse, velocity, and acceleration, many of the previously discussed corrections to the critical features could be applied. The degree of knee joint and hip joint flexion can be altered in conjunction with the sequential extension of joints to allow for the generation of a greater explosive force. The runner can also train to improve their reaction time, which will help them lower block clearance times. And outside of the set phase and block phase, a forefoot strike can be used to minimize horizontal braking forces in the first stance phase of that sprint. Thank you very much for listening to my analysis.